Welcome back to Psych. This is LCD sound system. Call the police. It's got nothing to do with today's lesson. Absolutely nothing. But I like the song. LCD sound system, call the police. It's getting a little old, but I love it. This is nowhere. Today's lesson, extending the timeline of psychology into the early 1800s. We covered the ancient Greeks, we covered the Enlightenment thinkers. Now we're going to move into some early 1800s psychological development stuff. Fresh little song. I like it. It's only a couple of years old. I don't know if you know it or not, but you should explore some new styles of music. All right. Today's lesson is on these early influences to psychology. We have moved, like I just said, through the ancient Greeks, through the Enlightenment philosophers. Now we're into the early 1800s, into actually what we would refer to as psychologists at this point. Still the beginning stages of psychology, but certainly highly interested in the psyche of the human mind and the totality of how the human mind works. First sort of branch in the early 1800s, first sort of development in psychology was this movement known as structural psychology. The case study we're going to focus on, there's probably dozens of psychologists that were working in this area in the early 1800s, 1830s, 1840s, but we're going to focus in our case study on Wilhelm Wundt. I love Wilhelm Wundt. I like German words in general because the W's are pronounced like V's. Wilhelm Wundt. How can you go wrong? Wilhelm had the goal to identify the structures of the psychological experience. Let's think about that for a second. What do they mean by the structures of the psychological experience? Well, basically, how do we bring information into our psyche, into the totality of the human mind? How do we bring information in, and how do we react to that information? That is the structural experience of what is going on. And so the structures, you'll know them well because you probably learned them in kindergarten. The 5 structures that we have that allow information to enter our brains, we refer to as our senses. And we could discuss whether there is a 6th sense. That might be a discussion worthy for class. But the 5 senses, right? We've got touch, smell, hearing, taste, and sight. Those are the 5 structures or the 5 senses on how we bring information into our brains. And then with those senses, we're going to have a little something else happen. Wilhelm found through his experiments that humans will bring information in through these 5 senses, and then it's sort of like, it's almost like those sliders, right, that sometimes we see where you can like slide 2 levers, maybe even on like turntables have them, or maybe sometimes those audio equalizer programs, you can slide a lever up and down. Sometimes I teach this almost like a thermometer also. We're basically going to have, and I'm really bad at drawing thermometers, so let's go with the thermometer viewpoint instead of the sliders. Boy, I don't know what that looks like, but anyway, here's 2 thermometers. And Wilhelm said that like the first sort of slider or the first thermometer that we have tends to measure these senses, this information that we bring in terms of good and bad, right? So there's different degrees, if you want to think of it like that, like on a thermometer, right? There's different degrees of goodness that each of these senses register. Wilhelm also thought that there was another little slider or temperature gauge, if you want to think of it like stick with our thermometer presentation. There's another little temperature gauge, and that measures how intense your arousal level is. Now, we'll get to the term of arousal. We're really basically talking about how excited your senses are. And so these measures of arousal will stem probably on the high side. We would call that being intense, right? You'd have intense arousal. And on the low side, we would call this subdued. So I could have a subdued amount of arousal or an intense experience with my arousal level when one of these senses come in. So I'm like, I live, just as a personal example, I live near a farm in Schuylerville, and when they fertilize the fields with fertilizer, and we all know what that is, my nose literally burns. Like, that smell is so intense and so bad, right, that my temperature gauges on that type of an experience would be something like this, just as an example. And what Wilhelm Wundt found was that there was about 40,000. I was going to double check that number because that sounds huge, right? You got to double check this number. No, it's right. He found that there is over 40,000 different sensations. And those are just the ones that he charted in the early 1800s, right? These two temperature gauges could combine through these 5 senses. So it's almost like a math problem. 5 times 1,000 times 1,000, right? I'm pretty sure whatever the math is. 40,000 different sensations that lead to us humans having these different experiences. So that is the field of structural psychology. Also, in the early 1800s, you had some psychologists that branched off and kind of went a different direction. They were functional psychologists. And a functional psychologist is trying to figure out why the subjects think the way that they do, right? Why do we, as humans, think the way that we do? And I sort of alluded to this idea a little bit in our early stages of different fields of psychology. This is one of the ones I find fascinating, this idea of evolutionary psychology. And it was really, evolutionary. It was really inspired by Darwin. Right? This is the same time period, this early 1800s, that Darwin was doing his thing with survival of the fittest. And so naturally, these really bright scientists that were kind of studying, right? This is Darwin inspired. They're studying what Darwin is learning about evolution and survival of the fittest in different species on Earth. And a lot of psychologists started believing, hey, you know what? I think our mind evolves differently. And so people, right, each individual's mind might be at a different evolutionary moment, right? Similar to the way that turtle shells, like Darwin studied, right? Or birds that Darwin studied on the Galapagos Islands. They were at different stages of their evolution based on their environment and the way that they adapt to a changing environment. And so these functional psychologists believed similarly that the human mind, the ones that were most fit for survival at any given moment in time were the ones that survived. And so the mind, right, subjects think maybe differently because our minds are at different evolutionary stages based on our genetics and the environment and the way that we've adapted to our environment. Okay, so let's see, Darwin inspired, and we just want to say that it's basically survival of the fittest mind. And what makes for the fittest mind? Well, again, that would sort of be determined by the environmental changes that a person has to adapt to. So for my money, functional psychology and evolutionary psychology sort of overlap. They're basically one in the same. Okie doke. That does it for our early 1800s psychologists, Wilhelm Wundt, he's not German, William James, right? And if we can kind of use this to build off of, now we're going to start to get into the late 1800s. And we're going to start running into some of the more famous names that you're probably familiar with, like Sigmund Freud will be next on our next episode. Thank you very much for joining. Be good. I'll see you in class.